We're in a small living room somewhere in Baghdad. The man in the grey suit is none other than Saddam Hussein. The boy with blue shorts is Stuart. He's 5 years old and from Britain. Next to them are other British families, and they look uneasy. And for good reason. Saddam has just called for the boy to come speak to him. He pulls him closer while making sure that the cameras capture everything. A smartly dressed interpreter next to Saddam is explaining what he's saying.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart? And with cornflakes too.
But Stuart doesn't say anything. He's completely frozen. Right now, you might be wondering what a 5-year-old boy from Britain is doing in a living room with one of the world's most notorious dictators, and you'd be right to wonder. You see, these people are not guests at some kind of weird dinner party. No, they're Saddam's hostages. He has taken them captive, and all this, with the families, the cosy little living room and the fake smiles, is all an effort to show the world that Saddam isn't really a bad guy at all. Actually, he's just misunderstood. And this meeting, this bizarre meeting, is to prevent war, as he puts it.
We are trying to prevent a war from happening.
ونعمل إنه استضافتكم ما راح تطول.
And we hope that you as guests, your presence as guests here, is not going to be for long, for too long.
لأنكم لستم رهائن.
Because you're not hostages here.
But it isn't true. Not one bit. And what Saddam and his smartly dressed interpreter don't mention is why he really took these families captive. But let's rewind a bit to 2 weeks ago. Saddam has just ended an 8-year-long conflict against Iran. The war, which Saddam initially thought would be a quick victory, has instead been a bloody and costly affair. When it finally ends in 1988, Iraq's economy is crushed. Saddam is left with an enormous debt. To keep his military running during the war, Saddam had to borrow from his neighbours. Rich neighbours like Kuwait. But now that the war's over, these rich neighbours want their money back, Kuwait included. But Iraq doesn't have any. They are, in every sense of the word, broke, or at least very close to it. Luckily, Saddam has had an idea. A great idea, he thinks. Kuwait is a small country, especially compared to Iraq, and they wouldn't stand a chance against Iraq's super-pumped military. In fact, the war with Iran has made Saddam's army the 4th largest in the world. What if you could kill 2 birds with 1 stone? If he can get his hands on all their oil and at the same time eliminate his enormous debt, then the problem would be solved. And so, Saddam plans his invasion. At the same time, he begins accusing Kuwait of stealing oil from Iraq by drilling too close to the border. He claims they're taking advantage of his generosity. And on August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi tanks roll across the border into Kuwait. The invasion is swift and brutal. Kuwait's small military is overwhelmed within hours, and by the end of the day, Saddam's forces control the entire country. From one day to another, Saddam goes from being a rather big but modest oil supplier to controlling 20% of all global oil supplies. Within hours of the invasion, leaders from around the globe condemn the attack. Even the Soviet Union aren't happy. The thing about invading your neighbour and invading in general is that it's not really something that makes you look good. And of course, having a guy like Saddam controlling so much of the global oil supply is not really something that the rest of the world is exactly happy about. And then there's the question, what will he do next? If he decides to suddenly go for Saudi Arabia, that would effectively make him the largest oil magnate on the planet. And that's just not going to work. And so, the US organises a massive coalition of more than 30 countries to try and scare Saddam into moving his troops out of Kuwait. If he doesn't, it's war. This puts Saddam in a bit of a pickle. If he agrees to their demands and pulls out of Kuwait, he'll have no money and will look incredibly foolish back in Baghdad. On the other hand, if he stays, he'll be invaded by basically every superpower in the world. To him, his only option is to figure out a way to stay in Kuwait and avoid being invaded. But as a matter of fact, Saddam believes he has a plan that will ensure just that. This. A publicity stunt using innocent British hostages as background extras. As you probably could have guessed, it's not working. At all. Instead of seeing a friendly uncle asking about his nephew's hobbies, people only see a ruthless dictator threatening innocent families and children. They're horrified, and so, realizing that his plan has failed, the families are let go sometime after. But Saddam is convinced that this will make the coalition change their opinion about him, and more importantly, his invasion. But he's wrong. By the end of November 1990, the UN Security Council decides enough is enough. Saddam must pull his troops out of Kuwait by January 15, 1991 at the latest. Otherwise, they'll declare war. But Saddam refuses. He's staying for good. Big mistake. Because just 2 days after Saddam's deadline, the Americans hold their word. Missiles and cluster bombs start raining down on Kuwait and Iraq from one day to another. And after weeks of relentless airstrikes, the Iraqi army is battered. As coalition tanks, troops, and armoured vehicles push into Kuwait and southern Iraq, the Iraqi defences start falling apart. His army of around 500,000 men is quite literally disintegrating in front of him. There is nothing they can do against the might of the Americans, and after just 4 days of fighting on ground, Saddam finally calls for a retreat. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers pile into anything that can move in a desperate attempt to get out of Kuwait. If they stay, they're as good as dead. But progress is slow, and they end up in an enormous traffic jam on the highway to the Iraqi border. They are, essentially, trapped. It's night, and the desert is pitch black. There is nothing to alert the Iraqi forces about the American jets heading their way, and before they know it, cluster bombs shoot down from the sky and obliterate the entire highway from one end to another, again and again and again. It'll later become known as the Highway of Death. The attack is so devastating that it influences Bush's decision to declare a ceasefire the next day. Saddam is now at the mercy of the Americans. If they decide to follow him into Iraq, there's absolutely nothing he can do to stop it. But they don't. Kuwait is once again free of occupation, and Bush Sr. doesn't want to get too involved in Middle Eastern affairs, so they just leave. Well, for now at least.